let's go ahead and get started back from our break. So we talked before our break a little bit about the 7 principles of raising a child with ADHD, and now I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship between parents and children with ADHD, which you guys are all experts in since you are all parents of children with ADHD. So I brought in this quote from Dr. William Dodson, and he's a psychiatrist that specializes in ADHD. And what the quote says is, children with ADHD will receive an estimated 20,000 more negative comments from parents, teachers, and coaches by the age of 12. So this isn't necessarily a statistic from a research article, but rather just an estimate that has been made on how many negative comments or criticisms or negative feedback, how much negative feedback a child with ADHD will receive around this age as compared to children who don't have ADHD. And the reason that I bring this up is because we know from research that children with ADHD have lower self-esteem, they struggle more with self-esteem, they struggle more with self-compassion, and they tend to have difficulties in relationships, whether that's with siblings, peers, or parents. And I don't bring this up to be pessimistic or to point out the struggles and difficulties in children with ADHD, but rather because I think there's something that we can do with this. And so let's get into a couple of things that we can do to help our children who have ADHD. So what we can do is we can focus on connecting before correcting. And what that means is essentially forming a relationship with your child and connecting with them before you correct the behaviors that you want to change with your child. So making sure that you have a strong attachment with your child, that you're close with them, and that you have a strong relationship with your child before moving on to correcting some of their behaviors. So you can do this in 2 different kinds of ways. You can look at it as an in-the-moment kind of thing, where you focus on making sure that you make your child feel loved and valued and seen in the moment when you're going to correct a behavior, but you can also do this as more of a lifestyle. And what that would look like is paying attention to making sure that your child feels loved and heard and seen and valued throughout life overall, so that when you do have to correct something that they've done and they do have to hear that negative feedback or criticism, it feels more constructive rather than destructive. So connecting before correcting is something that we can do as parents of children with ADHD, but also managing emotions as a parent of a child with ADHD. So a lot of times, because of the genetic nature of ADHD, parents of children with ADHD will have ADHD as well themselves. So this can make it difficult for us to regulate our own emotions when our children are feeling big emotions, or even when they're having disruptive kind of behaviors. But it is something that we can work on and that we can definitely do. And even if you don't have ADHD, I mean, just being a parent in general, it can be difficult to regulate ourselves when we're having to help take care of a child as well. But these are 2 major things that we can do in order to help our children thrive and move past these kinds of statistics, such as the quote that I gave you, or even the fact that children with ADHD tend to struggle with self-esteem and self-compassion. So there is something we can do about it. So let's get a little bit more into connecting before you correct. So one major way that you can do this is playing with your child for around 20 minutes each day. That's what I typically recommend as like a starting point for how much to play with your child. And while you do this, it's important that you notice what they're doing and interact with them in that way, but also notice what they're feeling at the same time. So it's really cool, actually, when children are playing, they're actually processing the things that have happened to them throughout the day or in their life, or even what they're thinking about and feeling. So if you look at what they're doing in their play, you can reflect that back to them and help them feel seen and heard, and like you understand what they're going through and what they're feeling in the moment. While you do this and while you play with your children, you can also encourage creativity as a way to connect with your child. So children will oftentimes play in ways that don't make sense to us. So they might fry an egg on top of a washer. They might put an egg on a washer and say, I'm frying this egg. And that makes absolutely no sense to us because, of course, you don't fry an egg on the washer, you fry it in a frying pan on the stove. And in real life, that might be a good teaching moment, but when they're playing, it can be a way to connect with your child by encouraging the creativity that they have and allowing them to be imaginative, allowing them to have a wild imagination and create however they want through play. Another way you can do this is through noticing aspects of your child and praising them that are outside of their behavior. So we want to praise their behaviors because this reinforces that they're doing something right and we want them to continue to do it. But we also want to make sure that we're noticing things in our children with ADHD that are good too, because like we talked about earlier, they're going to hear a lot of things that are bad about them, and we want to make sure that we're noticing the good things about them too. So while they're playing, noticing aspects of them that you appreciate about them, characteristics outside of things that are just behaviors that they do right. In addition to the way that they play and how you play with them, we can also look back at some of the conversations we've had about the information from Dr. Barkley's book and understand some of their ADHD symptoms. So just understanding why and connecting with them on that level and knowing that your child is not a bad child, they are just a child who is struggling with something. And they're most likely not intentionally defying you. I mean, they might be in some scenarios, but a lot of times with ADHD, they're not intentionally trying to be defiant. This is just a characteristic of their symptoms of being inattentive or being hyperactive or struggling to focus on things. And a lot of times that is just inherent to the nature of ADHD and they can't necessarily help it. So while they can't help it, we also want to help them thrive and succeed. And this is where parenting skills come in a connecting kind of way. So this would be an example of connecting before you correct more in the moment. So Dr. Barkley, if you think back to what we talked about in principle number 7, he talks about getting down on their level and looking them in the eyes and touching them, like holding their shoulder before you give a correction or before you give an instruction that you want them to do. So this is a way that you can connect with your children before you correct their behavior so that they know that they're seen and valued as well as appreciated for the behaviors that they do. So that's a little bit about connecting before correcting. And I also want to talk a little bit about how to find strengths in your children. I kind of hinted at this a little bit with the last point, but a lot of times we focus on the negative aspects of children with ADHD, but there's also a lot of strengths that we can look at with children with ADHD. And this can be a great way to become more connected with these children with ADHD, with your children with ADHD. To notice how they could have strengths in themselves that maybe they don't see and that maybe you haven't thought about before. So I have some examples for you here, but these are ultimately just my opinions and my ideas, and ultimately what matters more is how you view your child and the strengths that you can find in them. So some examples would be hyperfocus. And you might be thinking at this point, my child can't focus on anything because they have ADHD. But what actually happens sometimes with children with ADHD is that they will oftentimes become extremely focused on something because they're interested in it. And maybe you can think of a time that your child has gotten very, very interested in a video game or a sport or something that they really enjoy doing. And this could be an example of hyperfocus where they become very intensely focused. So they might lack focus in a lot of ways, but they also might have the ability to really focus on a lot of other things. Additionally, I think hyperactivity can be looked at as a strength. So whether you're hyperactive in movement and your speech, or if your thoughts are just all over the place and you're thinking all the time, there can be different aspects of hyperactivity that can be strengths for children. So, for example, your child might move around a lot, but they also might be a really good athlete. They might not be able to sit still in class, but they might become a pro football player. Who knows? Additionally, they might talk too much in class, but they might end up being a comedian or an actress or a newscaster or even a professor one day. And then as far as children who think a lot and are kind of always lost in their minds because their mind is just always going off somewhere else, they might be someone who is an innovator or an entrepreneur, somebody who is even an inventor who creates new things because their mind is always off thinking about different things outside of what's happening in the moment. So these are just some ideas of how children with ADHD might have strengths that we don't initially see, but in a few minutes I'm going to give you guys some time to think about strengths for your own child. But before we do that, let's go ahead and talk about the second way that we can help our children overcome some of the difficulties that come along with ADHD, and that's through managing our own negative thoughts and emotions. So there's 3 steps to managing our own negative thoughts and emotions, and the first step is just to be aware of your negative thoughts. So notice when you're having a thought about your child and what you're thinking when your child is doing something that maybe you don't want them to be doing. And consider what are the automatic thoughts that are coming into your brain when you notice something about your child, or you notice them doing something that you're not necessarily wanting them to do. Is your brain automatically going to, wow, I have the worst child ever, or I can't believe he's like that, or I wish he didn't have ADHD, or why is he just running around everywhere? Whatever thoughts you're having, just begin to notice them. And then the second thing we can do is to decrease negative thoughts. And some of these bullet points up here they're not necessarily things that are that you have to do, but just suggestions rather. And if you have something else that works better for you, by all means go for that. But one idea could be to reschedule worry or anger time. So setting aside specific time when you can be worried or angry about a situation. And then also objectifying the situation. So taking an outside perspective and not taking it personally. It can be so incredibly easy to take things personally when our children are misbehaving. It can feel like, wow, I'm doing something wrong. I can't believe they won't just listen. I don't understand why they keep doing this. And we can take it on personally and sometimes even feel like we're bad parents because of that. But if we objectify the situation, it can make it easier to handle it so that we don't blow up at our kids or say things that we don't really want to say or mean. And then also, we can just take a moment for ourselves as parents. So we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the section on self-care for parents, but just taking a step back and taking a moment for yourself and taking care of yourself as well, in addition to your child. And then finally, normalizing the situation. This is the last way that we're going to talk about with decreasing negative thoughts. And this just means feeling like the situation is a normal thing to happen. So this might be through your own thought process. This could also happen through talking to other parents. What it could practically look like is thinking to yourself, it's okay that this is happening. This happens to all parents, or all children do this at times, or even this is normal for a child with ADHD. Just normalizing the situation that's going on. And then the last step of things that we can do to manage our negative emotions and thoughts is to increase our positive thoughts. So this can look like disputing the negative self-talk that you have. So if you're thinking, my child is awful, you could dispute it with, well, here are these good things about my child. And then substituting calming thoughts for negative ones. So if you're having a negative thought about your child, you can replace that with something that makes you feel more calm about the situation. So if you're feeling really, really frustrated with your child and you're just really angry at what they're doing, you can replace that with something that might be a more calm thought. And this could even kind of go into the same concepts as decreasing negative thoughts, and such as normalizing the situation. So it could look like, I'm really angry at my child, and then reassuring yourself, but it's okay, it's all right that this is happening, this is normal for a child with ADHD. So kind of calming yourself down with your thoughts. And then praising yourself can also be an important part of this, because you probably are trying really, really hard to help your kids in the best way you can. So noticing that in yourself and praising yourself for the things that you are doing right, so that you don't respond in a way that is a way that you wouldn't want to respond to your children. Using humor can also be a really good coping mechanism when you're frustrated with your children. So just making light of the situation, noticing anything funny that you can find out of it. And then finally, modeling these coping thoughts, the coping self-talk and the self-praise. So when you are praising yourself for things that you're doing right, even modeling this for your child by doing it in front of them and showing them that it's okay to talk about good things about yourself, and it's okay to cope through self-talk. And this can help you regulate, but it can also help your child learn emotional regulation skills as well. So these are the 3 steps for how to manage negative thoughts. But now I kind of want to give you guys some time to talk as well, because I've been talking for way too long. So if you'll find 1 or 2 people next to you, I want you to think through, what do you struggle with as a parent of a child with ADHD? And also, what strengths do you see in your child coming from their ADHD? So go ahead and pair up with a couple of people around you and begin to discuss this.